The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. Ariel Carter heard it before she understood it. The soft, hollow knock of something small hitting hardwood. When she looked down, her wedding ring lay on the floor beside her bare foot. The diamond turned inward, hiding its face from the light. For a moment, her body refused to react. No gasp, no tears, just a strange stillness, like the pause after a judge's gavel falls, but before the courtroom exhales. Her chest felt tight, as if her lungs were waiting for permission to work again. On the kitchen counter behind her, Graham's leather travel bag sat open. Careless, confident, the way men are when they don't expect consequences. Ari hadn't meant to look inside it. She'd only gone to put it away because that was what she always did. Smoothed edges, closed gaps, kept life orderly so nothing fell apart too loudly. But the bag had tipped and something slid free. A small velvet box, navy blue, expensive, empty. Her eyes drifted, slow and unwilling, to the folded papers beneath it. Glossy, heavy, printed, not digital. That detail mattered. Someone had wanted these images to exist in the real world. The first photograph showed Graham laughing, not smiling politely, not performing charm for donors or city officials, but laughing, open-mouthed, unguarded. His hand was tangled in another woman's hair, intimate, familiar, the kind of touch that assumes permission. Ari felt the betrayal register in her body before her mind caught up. A heat behind her eyes, a hollowing in her stomach, a quiet, terrible click as something she had believed in rearranged itself into something else entirely. She flipped to the next photo, and the next. Different angles, different days, same woman. A receipt slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor, landing face up. Hotel. 2 names, 2 glasses of wine, 1 bed. Her breath came shallow now, sharp enough to hurt. Not because he had cheated, though that alone could have broken her, but because of how thoroughly he had done it, planned it, printed it, lived it. Then came the smallest cruelty of all. A folded itinerary, Santorini, the island she had been secretly researching for their anniversary, the place she had imagined surprising him with once the big housing discrimination case wrapped, the place that had existed, until this moment, as a fragile hope she carried quietly, the way women often do, carefully, so it wouldn't be a burden. Her fingers trembled as she set the papers down. The room felt too bright, too exposed. Outside, New Orleans moved on, cars passing, a distant laugh from the street, life unimpressed by the fact that hers had just split cleanly in 2. Ari slid the ring from her finger with deliberate calm. It resisted for half a second, catching at the knuckle like it wanted to stay. She twisted once, then again, until it came free. She didn't throw it. She placed it on the counter beside the photographs. The diamond finally facing up, catching the light it no longer meant anything to. If this moment is already pulling you in, if you've ever felt that quiet, bone-deep shift when the truth lands, take a second to like this story, follow the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this only reach the people who need them when we move together. Ari stood there for a long time after that, long enough for the initial shock to fade into something colder, more precise. She thought of all the nights she had waited up, convincing herself his late flights were delayed, of the way he'd kissed her forehead instead of her mouth when he came home, of how often he'd told her she was reading too much into things, said with a smile that made doubt feel like a personal flaw. Civil rights attorneys are trained to spot patterns, to follow money, to notice what doesn't add up. And suddenly, everything did. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Once, twice. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The truth was already here, spread out in front of her like evidence in a case she hadn't known she was building. Ari straightened her shoulders. The shaking had stopped. Whatever this was, whatever Graham thought he had gotten away with, it wasn't just an affair. It was a fracture, a fault line running beneath a life she had helped construct with care, integrity, and love. And fault lines, Once exposed, don't disappear. They wait. By morning, the kitchen looked ordinary again. The photographs were gone, sealed inside a manila envelope Ari had labeled with a date and a single word: evidence, as if naming it could keep it from bleeding through the walls. The ring sat in the back of a drawer, beneath a tangle of takeout menus and dead batteries, hidden like a weapon she wasn't ready to pick up. Outside, New Orleans wore its familiar face. The air was damp and sweet, carrying the scent of chicory coffee and magnolias, as if the city itself refused to acknowledge that one woman's marriage had detonated overnight. Streetcars clattered along St. Charles. Somewhere a trumpet practiced the same aching phrase again and again. Ari watched it all from her apartment window and tried to remember what it felt like to believe she was safe. Because safety had been the story Graham Whitaker sold her, softly, patiently, with the kind of confidence that made you feel foolish for doubting. Graham didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't threaten in ways that left bruises you could photograph. He wrapped control in tenderness. He packaged dismissal as concern. He made compromise sound like maturity. In public, he was perfection with a pulse. At fundraisers, he would stand half a step behind her, just enough to signal support without stealing focus. One hand at the small of her back like a promise. He knew everyone's names. He remembered donors' children, board members' anniversaries, councilmen's favorite bourbon. He leaned into conversation with an ease that made people feel chosen, and they adored him for it. More than once, someone had said to Ari, almost wistfully, "You're lucky he really worships you." Ari used to smile at that, used to feel the pride bloom in her chest, warm and embarrassing, like a teenager with a secret crush. Because she wanted to be worshipped, didn't she? After years of fighting eviction notices and slumlords and bureaucrats who spoke about suffering like it was a spreadsheet, she wanted one place in the world where she didn't have to argue for her worth. Graham had seemed like that place. He came into her life when she was exhausted, fresh off a high-profile case, bruised by the kind of victory that costs more than it pays. He offered dinners that felt like rescue, weekends that felt like rest, a steady hand at her lower back when the room tilted toward politics and money and men who smiled with their teeth, but not their eyes. He said he admired her work. He said it like he understood it, like he respected the weight she carried. Then, slowly, the praise began to change shape. At first, it was small, almost flattering. "You give too much of yourself," he would murmur while she scanned documents late at night. "You're allowed to breathe, Ari." He'd take her laptop, close it gently, kiss her forehead like a benediction. And she, always tired, always responsible, let him. Soon it became a pattern. He'd suggest she skip a community meeting because she needed a night off. He'd call her clients draining. He'd say the clinic would fall apart without her and that maybe that wasn't healthy. He'd encourage her to delegate, to step back, to trust him to handle the things he was better at: finances, connections, strategy. Graham spoke the language of power the way Ari spoke the language of law, fluently, with certainty, with the kind of authority that made other people relax. He insisted on paying certain bills because it was easier. He offered to introduce her to the right people because they would take her more seriously if she came through him. And Ari, who spent her days battling men who assumed she was angry, emotional, difficult. Ari, who was constantly measured against stereotypes before she opened her mouth, found herself grateful for the way Graham could walk into a room and make doors open. It felt like partnership. It looked like partnership. That was the danger. Because the perfect lie isn't the one that's entirely false. The perfect lie is built out of real moments, beautiful ones, arranged in a way that hides the trap. Ari could still see those moments now, as if replayed through the harsh clarity of courtroom lighting. The time Graham showed up at her clinic with a box of beignets for the staff, charming everyone into laughter, making them feel appreciated. The night he held her after she lost a case and whispered, "They didn't deserve you anyway." The way he brushed her hair away from her face when cameras were near, as if he wanted the world to witness his devotion. But there had been other moments too. Moments she had filed away under stress, under misunderstanding, under maybe I'm being unfair. The way his eyes drifted to his phone when she talked about a mother being evicted with 3 kids. The way he corrected her tone at dinners, quietly, privately, with a smile. You don't have to fight everyone, Ari. Not every room is a courtroom. The way he urged her to choose peace whenever peace required her to be smaller. And whenever she protested, whenever her instincts flared and said something is off, Graham would tilt his head, soften his voice, make it sound like he was worried about her. Are you okay? He'd ask, as if concern could erase the question. You've been so intense lately. I think you're burning out. Burnout, anxiety, stress. Words that made her doubt herself. Words that made the problem her, not him. That was the architecture of the perfect lie. A structure built so elegantly you didn't notice you were being walled in. Ari reached for her coffee and realized her hand was steady. She should have felt heartbroken. She should have been collapsing, cracking, calling someone, begging the universe to rewind. Instead, what she felt was something far more unsettling. Clarity. Because once you see the scaffolding behind the illusion, you can't unsee it. And in the sharp, quiet space where denial used to live, Ari began to recognize another truth. One that landed heavier than the photographs themselves. Graham hadn't just lied to her about love. He had been shaping her, managing her, steering her like a deal. And if that was true, then what else had he been building behind her back? The question didn't frighten her. It focused her. Ari turned from the window, picked up her phone, and opened her calendar. Not to plan her day, but to trace his. To map absences against meetings. To line up dates with board votes, donor calls, redevelopment hearings. A legal mind doesn't panic. It investigates. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the ache and the disbelief, a new feeling began to rise. Quiet, dangerous, and steady as a match held to dry paper. If Graham's love had been a performance, Ari was done applauding. Now she wanted the truth. All of it, no matter what it cost. Ari learned early in her career that memory is a dangerous witness. Memories blur. They soften edges. They bend under pressure and rearrange themselves to survive. In court, they were useful only when anchored to something harder. Paper, timestamps, numbers that didn't care how badly you wanted them to mean something else. So she didn't sit on the couch and cry. She didn't pace the apartment or rehearse conversations that would never happen the way she imagined. She cleared the dining table, wiped it down, and laid out a yellow legal pad like she was preparing for trial. At the top of the page, she wrote one word, timeline. Her phone lay beside it, unlocked. Not because she'd guessed the password, she hadn't needed to. Graham had never imagined she would look. His arrogance had always been practical like that. Face ID recognized her without hesitation, the screen blooming open as if nothing in her world had just changed. The first thing she noticed wasn't the messages. It was the calendar. Color-coded blocks filled the screen. Meetings, flights, conferences. On their own, they looked reasonable. Busy, important, impressive. But Ari didn't read them individually. She scanned for patterns, gaps, overlaps. She flipped to her own calendar and placed the phones side by side. That was when the air in the room shifted. Her promotion dinner, the one she'd celebrated alone with takeout, and a polite text from Graham about Europe being brutal this time of year, sat directly across from a 3-night hotel stay in Napa, marked as Investor Retreat. Her sister's visit, the only family Ari had left who still made the effort, coincided with a sudden emergency pitch in Miami. Ari remembered how apologetic he'd sounded on the phone, how he'd insisted she not change her plans on his account. Family is important, he'd said. I don't want to be the reason you're disappointed. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Next, Zurich, then Aspen, then Santa Fe. Cities that had once felt abstract, distant, belonging to a world Graham moved through with ease, while she stayed rooted in the work that mattered to her. And threaded through them all, like a signature, were bookings under a name he never mentioned. M. LeBlanc. Ari wrote it down, circled it once, then again. She opened the email app, typed the name into the search bar. The results populated instantly. Hotel confirmations, flight receipts, dinner reservations, messages archived under innocuous subject lines, deck revisions, media prep, client notes, the kind of titles designed to discourage curiosity. Ari opened one. Last night felt different, the message read. I didn't know it could be this easy. The reply came an hour later. It is when it's real. Ari stared at the words until they stopped looking like language and started looking like shapes. Her hand hovered over the table, fingers splayed, grounding herself in the cool wood. Not once, in 3 years of marriage, had Graham described their life together as easy. She kept going. The receipts told a story his voice never had. Luxury hotels booked under shell companies she recognized from donor lists. Flights charged to cards he claimed were corporate. Meals expensed as client development in cities where she knew no clients existed. It wasn't just an affair, it was infrastructure. Her phone buzzed, a calendar reminder she'd set weeks ago. Meet with Housing Coalition, 3 p.m. Ari laughed then, a short, humorless sound that startled her with its sharpness. Because there it was, another overlap. The day she'd testified at City Council against a redevelopment project that would displace hundreds of families, Graham had been at a private dinner with a PR firm executive, M. LeBlanc's firm. Ari's pen moved faster now. Dates, locations, connections. She pulled public records, campaign donation disclosures, LLC registrations. Her mind slipped into the familiar rhythm of case building, the controlled urgency that came when the stakes were high and the opposition underestimated her. And underneath it all, something colder took shape. She remembered Graham's sudden interest in her cases. The questions he asked late at night, framed as curiosity but sharp with strategy. The way he'd suggested settling certain lawsuits, argued that public fights weren't always the best use of her energy. You don't have to win every battle, he'd said once, gently, as if offering wisdom instead of restraint. Now she saw it clearly. He hadn't been protecting her. He'd been managing risk. Ari closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not the big moments, but the ones she dismissed as insignificant. The time he'd flinched when she mentioned a particular developer's name. The way he'd gone quiet when she talked about subpoenaing internal emails. The sudden donor introductions that came with unspoken expectations. He had known. Worse, he had planned. Her phone chimed again. This time, a text preview lit up the screen. Next week can't come fast enough. Santorini is going to feel unreal. Ari didn't open it. She didn't need to. The truth was no longer something she felt. It was something she could prove. And as she gathered the evidence, screenshots, PDFs, notes carefully dated and labeled, another realization settled over her with unnerving calm. Graham had bet on her being too trusting to check, too tired to connect dots, too invested in the image of their marriage to risk tearing it apart. He had mistaken her love for blindness. Ari stacked the papers neatly, slid them into a folder, and snapped it shut. In the world she lived in, facts didn't care about charm, or apologies, or how convincingly someone said your name when they were lying. Facts only cared about being seen. And once seen, they changed everything. There is a particular cruelty reserved for lies that arrive wearing concern. Ari had fought landlords who locked tenants out of their homes, corporations that buried harm under paperwork, officials who smiled while voting to erase entire neighborhoods. She knew intimidation. She knew corruption. She even knew cruelty. What she had not recognized until now was the violence of being gently told you were wrong about your own reality. As the evidence stacked higher on her desk, Ari felt something else rising alongside the clarity. Memory. Reassembled not as nostalgia, but as testimony. Each moment returned sharper, stripped of the softening language she had wrapped around it to survive. Graham had never told her she was stupid. That was the genius of it. He told her she was brilliant, just too close to things, too emotionally invested, too tired to see clearly. "You care so much," he would say, brushing her hair back when she questioned him. "That's your gift, but it also makes you imagine threats where there aren't any." Imagine. The word echoed now, sour and unmistakable. She remembered the first time she had felt that flicker of unease, a late-night call that ended too quickly, a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. She had asked lightly because she had learned that asking lightly made men less defensive. "Everything okay?" Graham had laughed, warm, affectionate. "God, Ari, you've been living in courtrooms too long. Not everyone is hiding something." She had laughed too, because laughing felt safer than insisting. From that day on, every instinct she had was put on trial. When she noticed he'd started locking his phone, it became stress. When he canceled plans, it was pressure. When he forgot details she'd shared, it was exhaustion. And when she finally voiced how small those things made her feel, Graham's response was always the same sermon, delivered softly, patiently, as if he were guiding her back to reason. "I'm worried about you," he'd say. "You're reading everything as a threat. That can't be healthy." Worried. Ari had spent her life being warned about anger, about tone, about how Black women had to be careful not to seem aggressive, unstable, emotional. She had learned early how easily concern could become a leash. So she listened, she second-guessed, she began to pre-edit herself, not just in public, but in her own home. She softened questions before asking them. She apologized for reactions that hadn't even fully formed yet. "I might just be tired," she'd say, before he could. "I'm probably overthinking," she'd add, as if offering him relief. And Graham would nod, relieved indeed. He would pull her close and tell her she needed rest, that she was doing too much, that maybe she should let him take the lead more often, just for a while, until she felt better. The worst part wasn't that she believed him, it was that she believed herself less. Ari stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror now, searching for the woman who had once trusted her own mind without hesitation. She looked the same dark eyes, same determined mouth, but something in her gaze had sharpened, like glass after pressure. She remembered the dinner party 6 months earlier, the one that should have tipped everything into focus. She had been excited, nervous, proud. Graham had invited investors, people who could change the future of her clinic if they cared to. Ari had cooked, cleaned, curated conversation like it was a performance she was desperate to get right. The night had gone well, too well. Laughter, compliments, handshakes that lingered just long enough to promise possibility. Later, while stacking dishes, Graham had leaned against the counter and said casually, "They liked you, but sometimes you come on a little strong when you talk about the work." Strong. She remembered how her stomach had dropped, how she'd nodded automatically, absorbing the critique like gospel. She'd replayed the evening in her head for days afterward, trimming herself down in memory until she could see exactly where she'd gone wrong. Now, with the benefit of truth, she saw what had actually happened. He had watched her shine and couldn't stand it. The realization settled heavily, not as rage, but as grief. Grief for the version of herself that had worked so hard to be palatable. Grief for every time she had chosen peace over truth, because someone she loved told her the truth was dangerous. Ari sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms to her knees until the urge to scream passed. Gaslighting didn't look like cruelty, she understood now. It looked like love with conditions, like support that required silence, like concern that only appeared when you stepped out of line. And the most devastating lie of all, the one she had repeated to herself until it felt like wisdom, was this: "If I just explain better, he'll understand." Ari let out a long breath. Understanding had never been the problem. Control had been the point. And as that truth finally took root, something fundamental shifted inside her. The guilt she had carried for years, quiet, constant, unnamed, began to loosen its grip. She wasn't too sensitive. She wasn't imagining things. She hadn't failed to love him correctly. She had been systematically taught to doubt herself. And once that lesson broke apart, It took the lie with it. The gospel Graham had preached, the one that told her to be smaller, quieter, more forgiving, lost its power the moment she stopped believing it was holy. In the silence that followed, Ari felt it clearly for the first time. Her anger wasn't wild. It was righteous, and it was awake. Madeleine LeBlanc had always believed she could tell the difference between being chosen and being hidden. She was good at reading rooms, better than most. It was how she'd built her career, smoothing narratives, redirecting attention, shaping perception until the story landed exactly where it needed to. Crisis management, her mentor used to call it, making chaos look intentional. So when Graham Whitaker entered her life, she told herself she recognized the signs. He was attentive in the way busy men are only when they mean it. He remembered details. He followed up. He didn't text at midnight just to disappear for days. He called when he said he would, sent calendar invites like proof. He spoke about his marriage carefully, with the solemn patience of someone carrying a burden he didn't know how to put down. "It's complicated," he told her the first time she asked. They were in a hotel bar in Santa Fe, low-lit and expensive, the kind of place where secrets felt appropriately dressed. "We've grown into different people. Ari lives for her work. I respect that, I just don't exist in her world anymore." Madeleine had nodded because she understood ambition, because she understood what it meant to outgrow a life without burning it down all at once, because she understood loneliness in rooms full of people. She had told herself she wasn't stealing anything. She was stepping into the space he said already existed. At first, it felt almost decent. He never rushed her, never treated her like a distraction. He talked about the future with a careful hope that made her feel like she was being invited into something real, not borrowed. When he complained about Ari, it was never cruel, just tired. She was intense, driven, always fighting someone. He said it with admiration laced with exhaustion. "She deserves someone who can meet her where she is," he'd said once. "I'm just not that person anymore." Madeleine had believed him. That was the lie she told herself, because it made her reflection easier to live with. But cracks had started to form. Hairline fractures she ignored because they didn't threaten the whole picture. Yet, he never invited her to certain cities. He avoided New Orleans entirely. He spoke about Ari's work vaguely, as if details were dangerous. And when Madeleine mentioned a housing redevelopment account her firm had just landed, big money, high profile, Graham's reaction had been sharp. "Be careful with that one," he'd said too quickly. "There's a lot of noise around those activists." Activists. Madeleine worked in public relations. She knew the word was often a euphemism for obstacle. She hadn't thought much of it until the email came through late one night, flagged urgent, a background brief. Internal use only. It outlined a potential reputation risk connected to a civil rights attorney in New Orleans. Ariel Carter, aggressive, unpredictable, known for inflammatory rhetoric, a problem that needed to be neutralized before it disrupted key stakeholders. Madeleine's stomach had dropped when she read the name. She stared at the screen, pulse quickening, as pieces began to slide into place. Not smoothly, but violently, like furniture dragged across hardwood. Graham's discomfort, his evasiveness, the careful way he'd framed Ari not as an adversary, but as a liability. The woman he claimed he no longer shared a life with was suddenly very much at the center of his business concerns. Madeleine scrolled. There it was, a proposed strategy, media pressure, quiet donor conversations, a suggestion couched in neutral language that Ari's emotional volatility could be leveraged if necessary. Madeleine felt heat crawl up her neck. She knew this playbook, had helped write versions of it before, had justified it as just business, just optics, just doing the job. But this time, the target had a face. A woman who had loved the man now sleeping beside her. A woman whose life Graham had described as distant, obsessive, cold. The mirror cracked. Madeleine closed her laptop and sat in the dark. The hum of the minibar, the only sound in the room. She thought of all the times Graham had framed himself as caught between two worlds, love and obligation, desire and duty. She thought of the tenderness he showed her, the promises, the island trips planned with such care. Santorini. The word tasted suddenly bitter. Her phone buzzed. If Ari doesn't back off the lawsuit, things could get messy. I might need you to help manage the narrative. Madeline stared at the message, fingers frozen above the screen. Help manage the narrative. That was when she understood, not intellectually but viscerally, that she wasn't the exception to Graham's rules. She was the next variable. The same man who had made her feel chosen had also made her complicit. He hadn't asked for her help yet, not explicitly, but he was positioning her, the way he positioned everything, subtly, strategically, with just enough intimacy to make refusal feel like betrayal. Madeline stood and walked to the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at her looked composed, capable, successful, and uncomfortably familiar. She had spent years helping powerful men smooth away inconvenient truths. She had told herself she was smarter than the women who got burned, more aware, more in control. But control, she realized, was the illusion Graham traded in best. Madeline thought of Ari, this stranger she knew only through filtered stories and a damning memo. Thought of the way her own name was now threaded through a plan designed to erase another woman's credibility. She felt something shift, not guilt exactly, recognition. Because the story Graham told about his wife, the one about intensity, instability, excess, was beginning to sound dangerously similar to the stories men told about women who refused to be managed. Madeline picked up her phone again. This time she didn't reply. She turned it face down on the counter and let the silence stretch. For the first time since she'd met Graham Whitaker, Madeline LeBlanc asked herself a question she'd been avoiding. Not, is he lying? But if he is, who does that make me? The answer waited, sharp and unavoidable, on the other side of the glass. Ari didn't sleep. Not because she was sobbing into pillows or reliving the photographs in slow-motion agony, though the images floated at the edges of her mind like a bruise you keep pressing just to confirm it's real. But because her brain had moved into a state she knew too well. Case mode. The kind that made time feel irrelevant. The kind that turned heartbreak into structure. The kind that said, if you're going to survive this, you need more than feelings. You need proof. You need strategy. You need to know where the trap is set and how deep. By the third night, the dining table wasn't a table anymore. It was an evidence board without the cork, sticky notes in neat rows, printouts clipped into labeled folders, a map of New Orleans with circles drawn around addresses she recognized, redevelopment sites, donor homes, the PR firm office downtown that belonged to Madeline LeBlanc. Ari's hands were steady as she worked. That frightened her more than trembling would have, because steady hands meant she was past the stage of wishing for a different truth. She'd been reading Graham's life the way she read landlords' financials, not for what they said, but for what they revealed by accident. She started with the shell companies. Most people didn't notice them. Letters arranged into names that sounded harmless, like a boutique law firm or a consulting group. But Ari had been around long enough to know that the dirtiest money preferred clean fonts. She pulled corporate registrations through public records, cross-referenced addresses, found overlaps with properties tied to redevelopment bids. One of the LLCs shared a mailing address with a law office that had shown up twice in her cases as counsel for interested parties. Interested parties. Another euphemism. Her phone buzzed with an email notification from the clinic's board treasurer. A forwarded message about a donor dinner Graham had helpfully arranged months ago. Ari opened it and felt her stomach tighten. The invitation list. Half those names were tied to the very developers she'd been fighting. She remembered that night now with brutal clarity. How Graham had stood close, murmuring names in her ear like he was feeding her intelligence. How he'd nudged her towards certain conversations, guided her away from others. At the time, she'd been grateful. She'd told herself he was proud of her, proud to introduce her to people with influence. Now she saw it as what it was. He'd been managing exposure. If Ari spoke too freely, too sharply, too honestly, she might scare off money that needed her silence. If she charmed them enough, They might think she could be controlled. Either way, Graham benefited. The trap under the love wasn't built in a day. It was built in compliments, in gentle steering, in moments that looked like care. Ari thought of the times Graham had asked about her cases, not with the curiosity of a partner, but with the precision of a man scanning for vulnerabilities. "How strong is your evidence?" he'd ask, casual. "How do you think the judge will lean? Is there a chance you're overplaying it? You don't want to look reactive." Reactive. The word slid under her skin like a splinter. He had framed his questions as admiration. "I'm just trying to understand your brilliant mind." But the pattern was unmistakable now. He gathered information the way investors gathered leverage, and Ari had handed it to him because she had believed in the intimacy of being known. She opened a folder labeled Redevelopment and pulled out a thick stack of papers, grant proposals, zoning changes, emails obtained through public requests. She found one message she dismissed months ago because it was vague, almost polite. A council staffer had written, "I'm hearing things. Be careful. Some people want you to disappear." Ari had read it, frowned, then gone back to work. Disappear sounded dramatic, like a threat meant to distract her. Now she heard it differently. She heard it the way tenants heard a landlord say, "You don't want trouble," right before the heat mysteriously stopped working. Ari leaned back in her chair, the room tilting slightly as exhaustion caught up to her. Her eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the bookshelf. Her and Graham at a gala, smiling in perfect alignment. His hand rested on her waist, his face angled toward hers like devotion. The picture looked poisonous now. Because love, real love, didn't require you to shrink. It didn't require you to compromise your principles to keep peace. It didn't come with hidden documents and friendly donors who expected favors. And Ari's love for Graham, she realized, had been used like currency. She scrolled through her phone again and found a thread she hadn't opened in months. Messages from a reporter who'd once covered her clinic's wins. The journalist had asked for comment on a rumor, something about Ari being difficult, unstable, too emotional to be objective. Ari had brushed it off at the time, smiled it away, kept moving. Now she saw the timing. The rumor had appeared the same week she refused a settlement offer that would have protected a developer's reputation. The same week Graham had flown to Miami. The same week Madeleine LeBlanc's firm was hired. Ari's throat tightened, not from grief, but from something else. A feeling she hated, the sense of being played. She stood and walked to the window. Down on the street, the city moved in its careless rhythm. Neighbors talking, a dog barking, someone laughing too loudly. Life continuing the way it always did when your life had stopped. She pressed her forehead lightly to the cool glass and closed her eyes. In her mind, she pictured Graham not as her husband, but as an opponent across a courtroom aisle. Charming, calm, certain he could talk his way out of anything. And she pictured herself no longer the woman apologizing for her instincts, no longer the woman grateful for his protection. She pictured herself as she truly was, a lawyer who knew how to dismantle a story with facts. When she opened her eyes, the reflection staring back at her looked unfamiliar, not broken, not softened, but sharpened into something dangerously clear. Ari returned to the table and pulled out a fresh legal pad. On the first line she wrote, "What did he gain?" On the second line, "What did he take?" And on the third, slower, like a vow she was making to herself, "Who helped him build it?" Because the trap under the love had a blueprint, and Ari was done living inside someone else's design. Graham came home at 8:17 p.m. Ari knew the time because she was standing in the kitchen, staring at the clock on the oven, watching the red numbers change like a countdown she hadn't agreed to, but couldn't stop. The apartment was quiet in the deliberate way she'd chosen. No music, no television, no ambient noise to soften what was coming. When the door opened, Graham entered the way he always did, as if nothing in the world could be wrong unless he acknowledged it first. "Hey," he said lightly, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl Ari had bought on a trip to Marfa. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran long." His voice was warm, familiar, It carried the practiced ease of a man who had never been forced to account for himself. Ari didn't turn around. She waited until he noticed the silence, until he felt it. "You okay?" he asked, loosening his tie. There it was, concern, perfectly timed. "You didn't answer my texts." Ari picked up his phone from the counter. She had placed it there carefully, screen dark, face down, like a boundary line. "Who's Madeline?" she asked. The question was calm, almost gentle. It surprised even her. Graham stilled. Just for a fraction of a second, so brief most people would miss it. But Ari had built her career noticing pauses like that. The micro moment when the truth scrambled for cover. "Why do you have my phone?" he asked instead. Deflection. Immediate. Predictable. "You left it here," Ari said. She finally turned to face him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was observant. "On the counter, in our kitchen." Graham smiled then, the one that used to disarm rooms. "Ari, come on. That's not the point. You can't just go through my—" "Who is she?" This time, her voice landed differently. Lower. Firmer. The kind of tone that ended depositions. Graham exhaled, slow and controlled, as if she were a child pushing him toward patience. "You're jumping to conclusions. You've been under a lot of stress lately, and I think—" She stepped closer and turned the phone face up. The screen lit the space between them. "Santorini is going to feel unreal." Graham's eyes flicked down before he could stop himself. Silence stretched. Not empty, loaded. For the first time since she'd met him, Graham looked unsure which version of himself to use. "Ari," he said softly, using her name like a touch. "Listen to me. It's not what you think." Ari nodded once. "It never is," she said. "Go on." The invitation threw him. He'd expected tears, accusations, noise, something he could manage. Instead, she waited. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Things have been complicated for a long time. Between us. You know that." "Yes," Ari replied. "I do. I know you told me that every time I noticed something didn't add up." His jaw tightened. "You're being unfair." "No," she said. "I'm being precise." She walked to the dining table and slid the folder toward him. The manila envelope made a soft sound against the wood. Final. Unemotional. Graham opened it. Photos, receipts, dates, notes in Ari's clean, deliberate handwriting. The color drained from his face. Not all at once, but in layers. Calculation replacing charm. Defense overtaking denial. "You went through my things," he said, the warmth gone now. "Yes. That's a violation." Ari tilted her head slightly. "So is planning a vacation with another woman to a place I was saving as a surprise for our anniversary." That landed. His mouth opened, then closed. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flashing through the cracks. "This doesn't have to be like this," he said, switching tactics. "We can work through it. People do. Affairs happen. They don't erase what we have." Ari studied him then, really studied him, the way she studied witnesses when she already knew the answer. "What we have," she repeated, "what we have is me building a life around someone who was never honest with me. What we have is me defending you while you position me like a liability. What we have is you living two lives while asking me to shrink mine." "You're being dramatic," he snapped. The words slipped out sharper than he intended. There it was. The reflex. Ari felt something settle inside her, heavy and certain. Not rage, resolution. "I want you to leave," she said. The sentence hung in the air, clean and unadorned. Graham laughed, incredulous. "Ari, stop. You're not thinking clearly. This is our home." She nodded. "It was. It stopped being that when you decided to build a secret one somewhere else." "You can't just throw everything away," he said, voice rising now. "Do you have any idea what this will cost you?" Ari met his eyes. "I do," she said, "and I'm willing to pay it." Something in her expression must have convinced him, because his posture shifted. The confidence drained, replaced by something closer to fear. "Ari," he tried again, softer now. Please, she didn't respond. After a long moment, he turned away and walked toward the bedroom. Ari remained where she was, listening as drawers opened, then slammed, as footsteps moved through the space like a stranger's. When the door finally closed behind him, the apartment didn't echo with loss. It exhaled. And in that quiet, Ari understood something that felt almost holy in its simplicity. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged. She hadn't screamed. And yet, everything had changed. People love a clean exit. They love the version where a woman walks out with her chin high, mascara untouched, a single suitcase rolling behind her like punctuation. They love a door that closes softly, a final look over the shoulder, a cinematic fade into freedom. That is not what happened to Ariel Carter. When Graham's suitcase thumped against the hallway floor and the door clicked shut behind him, Ari stood in the kitchen for a full minute without moving. The quiet wasn't peaceful yet. It was unfamiliar, like walking into a room that's been rearranged in the dark. Her hands were still steady. Her face was still dry. And then her body betrayed her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even loud. Her knees went weak first, as if the bones had suddenly remembered they were allowed to stop performing. The air thinned. Her heartbeat began to stumble, a frantic rhythm that didn't match her breathing. She reached for the counter to steady herself and missed it by inches, fingers scraping the edge hard enough to sting. Ari swallowed, once, twice, but her throat felt sealed. She had spent years training her voice to hold under pressure, depositing calm into every syllable, swallowing emotion like it was evidence that could be used against her. Now the calm snapped, and the sound that came out of her was not a sob, not yet. It was a gasp, a sharp, involuntary intake, like she'd been underwater and only just surfaced. She slid down the cabinet doors until she was sitting on the floor, back pressed against the wood. The cold tile seeped into her legs. Her palms were damp. The room tilted slightly, not from alcohol, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden absence of adrenaline. This was the part nobody posted, the part where freedom and grief arrived together, tangled. Ari pressed a hand to her chest and tried to slow her breathing the way she'd taught clients to do when panic rose. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Again, it didn't work. Not at first. Her phone buzzed on the counter above her. The sound seemed too bright for the darkness that had settled inside her. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. She could already hear Graham's voice in her head, the one he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "You're not thinking clearly. You'll regret this. Do you know what this will cost you?" Her stomach twisted. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, just to anchor herself to something real. Then the thought came, the one that scared her because it sounded like relief. What if he's right? Ari closed her eyes. In that instant, she saw herself calling him. Just one call, just to stop the shaking, just to feel the familiar shape of his attention wrap around her nerves like a blanket. She saw herself apologizing without meaning to, softening the edges, agreeing to talk tomorrow, because tomorrow always felt safer than now. She hated herself for how easily the fantasy formed, not because she wanted him back, because her nervous system still recognized him as home, even after the truth had made that home unlivable. That was what love did when it was laced with control. It rewired you. It made the cage feel like shelter. Ari opened her eyes and looked at the dining table. The folders were still there, neat and labeled. Her handwriting looked calm, almost elegant, like it belonged to someone else. She forced herself to stand, not because she felt strong, because she knew what came next if she didn't move. She walked to the bedroom and began, quietly, to do what she did best. Prepare. Not a runaway bag, a safety bag. Passport, birth certificate, social security card, the flash drive with her case files, the external hard drive Graham didn't know existed, the folder of financial statements she had finally printed after years of trusting him to handle it, her clinic's incorporation documents, the spare set of keys to the office. She moved with methodical precision, pausing only when her hands started to tremble again, breathing through it until they obeyed. Every item she packed was a sentence. I am not confused. I am not impulsive. I am not powerless. In the living room, her phone buzzed again. She checked it this time. A message from the board treasurer. Hey, Graham called. Said you're upset and might be making decisions you'll regret. He asked if we could schedule a meeting to support you. I told him I'd check with you first. Ari stared at the screen until the words blurred. There it was. The trap under the love, snapping shut the moment she stepped out of line. He hadn't even made it an hour before he started narrating her. Upset, regret, support, language that made her sound unstable without ever using the word. Ari set the phone down slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile inside her. She felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears yet, but fury, clean and bright. He was already moving pieces. Fine. So would she. Ari opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months. Simone Baptiste, a friend, a fellow attorney, a woman who had seen too many nice men weaponize concern. Ari hesitated for half a second, pride flaring like a reflex. Then she pressed call. Simone answered on the second ring. Ari? Ari tried to speak. Her voice cracked on the first attempt, a small betrayal that made her grip the phone harder. I need somewhere to go tonight, she said, and I need you not to ask a lot of questions yet. There was a pause, brief, steady, the kind of pause that meant Simone understood exactly how serious this was. Say less, Simone replied. I'm coming. Ari exhaled, and for the first time all night, the air reached the bottom of her lungs. She stood in the doorway 20 minutes later with a tote bag that looked ordinary, too ordinary for what it contained. She took one last look at the apartment. The place didn't look like betrayal. It looked like a life. It looked like continuity. It looked like the kind of stability people envied. That was what made it dangerous. Ari locked the door behind her and slid the key into her pocket. Not because she was sure she'd never return, because she refused to return the same. As she walked down the hallway, the panic returned in a small wave, hitting her ribs. She kept moving anyway, step by step, letting the fear ride along like a storm you can't stop, but can outlast. Outside, the night air of New Orleans wrapped around her, warm and damp, alive with distant music. Ari lifted her face to it and kept walking. Not vanishing, not yet, just choosing, quietly, fiercely, to live. Grief didn't arrive the way Ari expected. It didn't knock politely or collapse her into sobs the moment Simone closed the door behind her. It waited. It watched. It let her unpack the tote bag onto the guest bed with hands that still worked. Let her shower and scrub her skin until the water ran cold. Let her lie down fully clothed and stare at the ceiling fan turning slow, hypnotic circles. Then, sometime near dawn, it bit. The pain came sharp and sudden, like a jaw clamping down on bone. Ari woke with a gasp, her heart racing as if she'd been running from something she couldn't see. The room was dark, unfamiliar. For half a second, panic flared. Then memory rushed in, merciless and complete. She had left. She had really left. Her throat closed. Her eyes burned. The grief she'd been outrunning caught up all at once, dragging behind it a convoy of smaller, meaner feelings. Shame, doubt, longing, an ache so specific it felt like it had his name carved into it. Ari pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from making noise. Simone had given her space, the kind that respected survival. Ari didn't want to fill it with the sound of breaking. This was the part no one warned you about. The morning after clarity, when certainty fades just enough for fear to crawl in. She lay there, cataloging the losses like wounds. The life she thought she had. The future she'd planned quietly, carefully. The version of herself that had believed love could coexist with control. And beneath it all, the most humiliating truth of the night, she missed him. Not the man he was, the man he pretended to be. The rhythm of their mornings, the familiar weight of his presence in the room, even when it annoyed her. Her nervous system, traitorous and slow to learn, reached for what it knew. "You overreacted," a voice whispered. Not his voice, hers. Or a version of hers shaped by years of being told to soften, to understand, to forgive first. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and sat up before the thought could root itself. Ari knew this feeling. She'd seen it in clients who escaped abusive landlords, in women who left marriages that looked respectable from the outside. The body lagged behind the mind. The grief wasn't proof of a mistake, it was withdrawal. Still, knowing didn't make it hurt less. By mid-morning, the messages started. Not from Graham, not yet, but from the edges of her life, where concern and curiosity blurred into something sharper. "Just checking in. Heard you were having a rough night. Graham says you might need support." Support. The word had teeth now. Ari read the messages without answering. Her hands shook slightly as she set the phone down. The quiet threat beneath the concern was unmistakable. He was already shaping the story. She dressed carefully, as if appearance were armor. Dark jeans, a crisp blouse, hair pulled back tight enough to keep her thoughts from escaping. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she paused. She looked different, not broken, not fragile, hollowed maybe, sharper around the edges, like something that had been cut free and was still bleeding, but undeniably separate. At the clinic, the air felt heavier than usual. Conversations dipped when she walked by. A colleague offered coffee she hadn't asked for, eyes lingering a beat too long. Ari closed her office door and sat at her desk, the weight of the day pressing down on her chest. For a moment, a dangerous flickering moment, she considered calling Graham, not to reconcile, just to stop the ache, just to say, "Can we please talk like normal people again?" Her fingers hovered over his name. Then her computer chimed. An email from a journalist she recognized. Subject line carefully neutral. Request for comment. Her pulse spiked as she opened it. There it was, framed politely, vaguely. A question about internal instability at the clinic. About whether Ari's personal situation might be affecting her professional judgment. Ari leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Grief had teeth, but so did anger. And anger, when it arrived, didn't bite blindly. It sharpened. She thought of the panic she'd felt on the kitchen floor, the way her body had begged for the comfort of the man who'd caused the harm, the way shame had tried to convince her that strength meant silence. Number. She opened her eyes and straightened in her chair. This wasn't weakness. This was the cost of leaving a system designed to keep her compliant. The pain was real, but it wasn't a signal to go back. It was proof she had torn herself free from something that had wrapped around her too tightly. Ari began to type her response to the journalist. Measured, factual, calm. She didn't overshare. She didn't defend herself emotionally. She stated her position and drew a boundary. As she hit send, a strange thing happened. The ache didn't disappear, but it loosened, just enough for her to breathe. Ari understood something then that would carry her through the weeks ahead. Grief wasn't her enemy. It was a test of endurance, a reminder that love, even when it's poisoned, leaves marks. She could live with marks. What she would not live with anymore was a lie. And as the day wore on, with its whispers and looks and carefully disguised threats, Ari felt it clearly, even through the pain. Grief had teeth, but she had learned how to bite back. The first article didn't mention Ari by name. It didn't have to. Spoke in careful abstractions. A prominent New Orleans legal clinic, internal turbulence, sources close to the situation. It framed concern like a public service, wrapped speculation in neutral language, and ended with a quote from an unnamed donor about the importance of stable leadership during sensitive negotiations. Ari read it twice, then a third time, not because she was confused, but because she recognized the craft. This wasn't gossip. It was strategy. By noon, the phone calls began. Board members asking for meetings just to touch base. Longtime partners suddenly cautious, their voices measured, professional. A city council aide she'd worked with for years canceled lunch with an apology that sounded rehearsed. Ari sat in her office, door closed, listening to the city hum outside her window. Sirens in the distance, construction noise, progress, always framed as inevitable. She thought of Graham then, not as her husband, but as a tactician. He had never needed to destroy her outright. That would have been messy, too obvious. Instead, he was doing what men like him always did to women who stopped being useful. He was questioning her credibility. The rumors sharpened quickly. Ari was emotional. Ari was distracted. Ari was letting personal issues interfere with her judgment. Ari had always been passionate, but maybe too passionate to be objective. The words slid into place with chilling efficiency. She saw the pattern the way she saw patterns in discriminatory housing practices. Small acts, repeated just enough to become truth adjacent. No single accusation to refute, just a fog thick enough to slow her down. By the end of the week, 2 donors had paused their contributions. One asked, carefully, whether it might be wise for Ari to step back from public-facing cases until things settled. Ari ended the call politely and sat in silence afterward, her hands flat on the desk. The urge to scream rose fast and hot, but she didn't let it out. Rage was expected. Rage would confirm the story they were writing about her. Instead, she opened a notebook and began to document. Date, time, who said what, who withdrew, who hesitated. Because reputation wars weren't won with outrage. They were won with records. Still, the toll was real. Ari felt it in the way her chest tightened before meetings, in the way she measured every word twice before speaking, in the exhaustion that settled into her bones, deeper than lack of sleep. She had known, intellectually, that leaving Graham would cost her. She hadn't known the bill would come due so fast. The worst part wasn't the whispers. It was the isolation. Friends who used to call now texted, brief and careful. Invitations stopped. The silence felt deliberate, like a room clearing before a verdict. One evening, as Ari walked to her car after work, a man she didn't recognize called her name. Her body tensed instantly. "Ms. Carter," he said, holding up a phone. "Mind if I ask you something?" Her pulse spiked. "Who are you?" "Just a blogger," he replied easily. "People are saying you torpedoed a major redevelopment deal because of a personal vendetta. Any truth to that?" Ari stared at him, the streetlight casting harsh shadows across his face. "No," she said calmly. "People are lying." She got into her car and drove away, hands gripping the wheel harder than necessary. That night, she sat in Simone's kitchen, untouched food growing cold between them. "They're trying to make you radioactive," Simone said quietly. "Not guilty, just risky." Ari nodded. "I know." "Do you want to go public?" Simone asked. "Tell your side?" Ari considered it. The temptation was strong, to lay everything bare, to expose Graham, to burn the narrative down. But she'd spent too long in courtrooms to confuse truth with timing. "Not yet," she said. "This isn't about convincing people I'm right. It's about proving it." Simone watched her for a long moment. "You're going to need allies." "I know," Ari replied, "and I know exactly where to look." Later that night, alone in her borrowed bedroom, Ari opened her laptop and pulled up a list she'd been avoiding. Journalists who asked hard questions, watchdog organizations, former clients who had nothing to lose and everything to say, developers who had clashed with Graham and survived, and one name she hadn't expected to type: Madeleine LeBlanc. Ari stared at it, fingers hovering above the keyboard. She didn't trust Madeleine. Not yet. But she recognized the signs of someone who had been used, and who might be ready to tell the truth. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, a warning without rain. Ari closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. This was no longer just about her marriage, or even her career. It was about who got to tell the story of who she was. And Ari had never been willing to let someone else write her into silence. The reputation war had begun, and this time, she was ready to fight it on her own terms. Ari learned quickly who disappeared when things got hard. They vanished politely, with apologies, with "let's circle back soon," and "you know I support you, just not publicly right now." They faded the way people do when proximity to you starts to feel expensive. She stopped taking it personally because something else was happening at the same time. Quieter, slower, far more dangerous to the people trying to erase her. The right people were leaning in. They didn't arrive with speeches or dramatic declarations. They arrived with questions, with documents, with careful looks that said, "I see what's being done to you, and I recognize the pattern." The first was Clara Nguyen, an investigative journalist Ari had once helped pro bono when a source tried to intimidate her into silence. Clara didn't ask Ari how she was holding up. She asked for timelines. "What exactly changed after you refused the settlement?" she said, pen already moving. "Who benefited?" Ari slid over a folder. Clara didn't smile. She nodded. "Good," she said. "This is a system, not a scandal." Then came Marcus Delacroix, a real estate analyst with a reputation for being unbuyable. He'd been tracking shell companies tied to redevelopment money for years and had hit walls he couldn't explain. Until Ari's name started circulating. "You're the common denominator," he told her over coffee, "which means you're not the problem. You're the obstacle." Ari felt something loosen in her chest at that. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The most unexpected ally came from the tenants, women who had lost apartments, men who had watched neighborhoods hollow out around them. People Ari had represented years ago, quietly, without cameras. They showed up, not all at once, one by one, with stories, with records, with memories that hadn't softened over time. "You warned us," one woman said, gripping Ari's hand. "They didn't listen, but we did." It was grounding in a way nothing else was. Proof that her work had mattered long before it became inconvenient. And then, Madeline. The email arrived at 2:14 a.m. Subject line, blank. No greeting. "I don't know if you'll believe me. I didn't believe myself at first either. But I think I can help. If you're willing to talk, I'll tell you what I know." Ari stared at the screen for a long time. This was the moment people expected her to reject. To protect herself by drawing hard lines. To say you were part of the harm and mean you will never be part of the repair. But Ari had learned something in the weeks since she left Graham. Justice didn't require purity. It required honesty. They met in a quiet cafe near the river, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into background noise. Madeline arrived early, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. She looked smaller than Ari expected. Not weaker, just exposed. "I didn't know at first," Madeline said, words tumbling out before Ari could speak. "I swear, he told me you were separated, that you'd chosen work over everything else, that you didn't want to be married anymore." Ari listened, not to judge, to assess. "And when you found out?" Ari asked. Madeline swallowed. "I realized I was being positioned, the same way you were, just for a different role." She slid a flash drive across the table. Internal memos, strategy drafts, communications that never went public. Her voice shook slightly. "And proof that Graham coordinated with my firm to undermine you." Ari didn't touch the drive yet. "Why give this to me?" she asked. Madeline met her eyes. "Because if I don't, I become the kind of woman I've spent my career pretending not to be." The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was heavy with consequence. Ari nodded once. "There will be fallout." "I know," Madeline said. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to let the truth stand." That was the difference. Saviors wanted gratitude. They wanted control. They wanted to be the reason you survived. Allies wanted alignment. Ari took the flash drive. From there, the network formed. Not flashy, not centralized. A series of quiet commitments. Clara would publish when the documentation was airtight. Marcus would map the money. Tenant leaders would speak, on record, with legal protection. Madeline would testify if necessary and accept the consequences. No one asked Ari to step back. No one asked her to soften the truth. They didn't rescue her. They stood beside her. Late one night, as Ari organized files and cross-checked names, Simone watched her from across the table. "You know," Simone said, This is what scares men like him the most. Ari didn't look up. What? You're not alone anymore, Simone said. And you're not asking anyone to save you. Ari paused, letting that set. She thought of Graham, of how he had thrived in isolation, in whispered narratives, in rooms where he controlled the flow of information. She thought of how much energy it took to keep someone small when they were surrounded by people who could see them clearly. This wasn't revenge. It was exposure. And as Ari closed another folder and labeled it carefully, she understood something with quiet certainty. When the truth finally came out, it wouldn't sound like shouting. It would sound like many steady voices telling the same story, and no one, not even Graham, would be able to talk over it. Ari waited. That was the part no one saw coming. In movies, justice is loud. It arrives with confrontations, exposés, dramatic resignations that trend before lunch. But Ari had learned, through courtrooms and community rooms, and years of watching powerful people slip consequences, that the most effective strikes were quiet, clean, unavoidable. She didn't leak anything. She didn't post cryptic messages. She didn't correct the rumors circulating about her instability or emotional state. Every instinct in her screamed to defend herself, to reclaim the narrative before it calcified into fact. Instead, she documented every email that went unanswered, every donor who withdrew after a private conversation, every city official who suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. Patterns emerged like ghost images in a dark room. And then there was Graham. He reappeared the way men like him always did, when they sensed the ground shifting under their feet. He called first. Ari let it ring. He emailed next. Polite, professional, framed as concern. I think we need to talk. This has gotten bigger than both of us. She didn't reply. 2 days later, he showed up at the clinic. Not angry, not desperate, calm, carefully dressed. The version of himself he used when he wanted to seem reasonable to people who didn't know him well. The receptionist buzzed Ari's office. There's a Mr. Whitaker here to see you. Ari closed the file she was reviewing and stood. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. Send him in, she said. Graham entered with the confidence of someone used to being granted access. He smiled when he saw her, relief flickering across his face like he'd expected to find her unraveling. Ari, he said, you look good. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. What do you want? He sat, crossing his legs, leaning forward slightly. Intimacy as tactic. I'm worried about you, he began. This situation, our situation, it's spiraled. People are talking. I don't want this to damage what you built. Ari studied him the way she studied contracts, line by line, looking for hidden costs. You didn't seem worried when your associates were calling donors behind my back, she said evenly. His smile faltered, just a fraction. You don't know that. I do, Ari replied. She slid a single document across the desk. 1 page, highlighted. Names redacted except his. Graham's eyes dropped. The color drained from his face. You went too far, he said quietly. No, Ari said. I finally went far enough. He straightened, irritation replacing concern. You're making enemies you don't need. This city is small. You don't want to be seen as volatile. There it was again. The word sharpened for use. Ari leaned back in her chair. I'm not volatile, she said. I'm methodical. She stood, walked to the door, and opened it. I'm done meeting with you, she said. Any further communication can go through my attorney. Graham stared at her, disbelief hardening into something colder. You think you've won? Ari met his gaze. I think you've already lost. He left without another word. The strike landed 3 days later. Clara's article went live at 6 a.m. Not sensational, exhaustive. Names, timelines, financial records, corroborated testimony from tenant leaders and analysts. No speculation, no adjectives that could be dismissed as bias. Just facts. By noon, a second outlet picked it up. By evening, a third. Questions followed, first polite, then sharp. City officials issued statements about reviewing relationships, Donors froze contributions, not to Ari's clinic, but to the redevelopment entities now under scrutiny. Marcus released his analysis the next morning, mapping shell companies and money flows with surgical precision. The connections were undeniable. And then Madeline spoke. Not in an interview, in sworn testimony. She didn't dramatize. She didn't apologize. She confirmed documents, authenticated emails, and stated plainly that strategies had been discussed to undermine Ari's credibility. The fallout was immediate. Graham's firm announced an internal investigation pending review. Partners distanced themselves. A board member resigned. City council postponed votes tied to projects Ari had challenged. Ari watched it unfold from her office, phone vibrating constantly on the desk. She didn't answer most of the calls. She didn't need to. For the first time since this began, the narrative wasn't about her emotional state or personal life. It was about accountability. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Mississippi, Ari stood alone in her office, the building quiet around her. She felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. What she felt was steadiness. The clean strike hadn't destroyed everything in its path. It hadn't burned the city down or turned her into something unrecognizable. It had simply removed the lies that had been holding the wrong people up. Ari gathered her things and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to reframe what had happened. But tonight, she allowed herself one small truth, whispered only to the quiet room. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She hadn't rushed. And because of that, the truth had nowhere left to hide. Graham Whitaker returned 6 weeks after the story broke. Not because he was brave, not because he was remorseful, but because men like him always believed there was one more angle left. One more conversation where charm could outperform consequences. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that felt deceptively ordinary. Ari's office hummed with quiet purpose. Phones rang, printers breathed. A junior attorney laughed softly down the hall, the sound of momentum uninterrupted. Ari stood at the head of the conference table reviewing documents with her team. Housing maps spread wide, notes layered like strategy. When the glass door opened behind her, she didn't turn right away. She recognized the shift in the room before she heard his voice. The way attention stalled, the way bodies went still. Ari, he said her name the way he used to, familiar, proprietary, expecting the room to bend around him. She finished her sentence first. "And we'll file the injunction by Friday," she said calmly. "Any questions?" No one spoke. Not because they were intimidated, but because they were watching her. Ari closed the folder, then turned. Graham stood just inside the doorway, suit impeccable, face composed with the effort of a man trying to look unchanged, while everything else had moved on without him. For a heartbeat, he smiled. Relief flickered across his face when he saw her upright, focused, surrounded by colleagues instead of wreckage. "Hey," he said, "I think we need to talk." The room held its breath. Ari looked at him the way one might look at a delivery person who had wandered into the wrong office. "I'm sorry," she said pleasantly. "Who are you here to see?" The words landed with surgical precision. Graham blinked. Once. Then again. "Ari," he said, lowering his voice as if intimacy were still available to him. "Don't do this." She glanced at her watch. "I have a meeting in 4 minutes," she replied. "So if you're here on clinic business, you'll need to speak with our operations director." "I ended it," he said quickly. "With her, I've made changes." There it was, the offering, the assumption that improvement entitled him to re-entry. Ari tilted her head slightly, considering him not as a husband, not even as an enemy, but as a variable no longer relevant to the equation in front of her. "That's good," she said. "For you." His mouth tightened. "You don't have to be like this. We built something together." "No," Ari said gently. "We didn't." She stepped past him, collecting her notebook, utterly unbothered by the proximity. Her team watched, silent, alert. "What we built," she continued, "was a situation where you benefited from my silence. I'm not participating in that anymore." Graham's voice sharpened. You think this makes you look strong? Ari stopped, turned back to him fully now. I'm not performing strength, she said. I'm exercising clarity. The word clarity hit harder than anger ever could. He searched her face for something. Regret, longing, the woman he'd trained to respond to him. He found none. You're really going to pretend I don't matter? He asked. Ari met his eyes. I don't have to pretend, she said. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was complete. One of her colleagues shifted, subtly, standing a little straighter. Another closed a laptop, ready to follow her lead. The room had already chosen its alignment. Graham exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through his composure. This isn't over, Ari nodded once. For you, maybe. She opened the conference room door. Please leave, she said. You're disrupting our work. He hesitated, long enough for the imbalance to become unmistakable. Long enough for him to understand that he was no longer the axis around which her life turned. When he finally walked out, no one watched him go. The door closed. The hum returned. Ari turned back to her team. Where were we? She asked. A junior attorney answered immediately, voice steady. The injunction timeline. Ari smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just present. As the meeting resumed, something subtle but irreversible settled into the room. This wasn't a woman proving she had survived betrayal. This was a woman for whom the betrayal had become irrelevant. Later that day, a clip from the hallway security camera would circulate online. No audio, just the image of Graham leaving her office, while Ari stood composed, untouched by his presence. It would rack up views in the millions. People would call it savage, cold, iconic. Ari never watched it. She didn't need to. Because the moment that broke the algorithm wasn't about humiliation. It was about what happened when a woman stopped explaining her worth and simply went back to work. The city didn't collapse when Graham fell. It adjusted. Like a machine that had been grinding for so long, it barely noticed when one gear cracked. Only the people caught beneath it felt the shift. Contracts were rewritten. Names were removed from letterhead. Statements were issued with careful neutrality. Everyone who had once smiled beside Graham found new distances to stand at. The investigation moved faster than Ari expected. Not because justice suddenly became urgent. New Orleans had never been famous for hurrying toward the truth, but because money hates uncertainty. Investors demanded clarity, boards demanded containment, politicians demanded someone to sacrifice before the scandal stained election season. Graham's firm announced personnel changes. Partners resigned to pursue other opportunities. A redevelopment project tied to 3 shell LLCs was quietly paused, then quietly rebranded under a different name, as if changing the label could change the rot. And Graham kept insisting he could fix it. At first, he tried to out-charm it. He did interviews with sympathetic outlets, speaking in polished phrases about miscommunications and narratives being spun. He praised Ari's passion in public, the way men do when they want to sound generous while still implying you're difficult to handle. Then he tried to outspend it. He hired a crisis team even better than Madeline's old firm, filed motions, threatened countersuits. His lawyers moved like sharks, circling the clinic for any vulnerability. But the evidence didn't flinch. Facts, once arranged cleanly, have a cruel patience. The first real crack came when a former colleague, someone Graham had once dismissed as replaceable, agreed to cooperate with investigators. Emails surfaced, meeting notes, a paper trail that didn't just suggest questionable ethics, but deliberate manipulation. Then came the warrant. Ari wasn't there when it happened, but she heard about it in fragments that spread through the city like heat. Federal agents at a downtown office. Phones seized. Files boxed. People staring out windows like they were watching a storm approach, but realizing too late they were already inside it. By evening, Graham's name was everywhere, and so was Ari's. Not as the unstable woman from the whispers, not as the emotional spouse, but as the attorney whose clinic had refused to be pressured into silence. It should have felt like victory. It didn't, because the cost arrived with the fall. swift and personal. It came in the form of a voicemail left at the clinic's front desk. A man's voice, low and amused. "Tell Ms. Carter she better watch herself. This city has a way of humbling people." Ari listened to it once, face unreadable, then handed it to Simone without a word. It came in the form of strangers lingering too long near her car. A car that followed her for 3 blocks and peeled off only when she made a sudden turn into a crowded street. It came in the form of an email to Clara, CCing Ari, from an anonymous address. "You wanted a story? Let's see how brave you are when it's your family." Ari stared at that line until her vision narrowed. She had known the risk in theory. She had not expected the fear to have such a physical presence, to sit in her throat, to creep into quiet moments, to make her listen for footsteps that weren't there. And then there was the other cost, the quieter one no headline captured. Ari's mother called from Baton Rouge, voice shaking. "Baby," she said, trying to sound calm and failing, "people are saying things. On Facebook. They're calling you names." Ari closed her eyes. She could handle being attacked. She couldn't stand the idea of her mother absorbing it, reading strangers' hatred like it was a verdict. "This is what they do," Ari said softly. "They make it ugly so you'll stop." "Are you going to stop?" her mother whispered. Ari looked out her office window at the street below, at the city that had always demanded Black women be twice as careful to be considered half as credible. "No," she said, "but I'm going to be smart." That night, Simone insisted Ari stay somewhere else. A different place, a rotation of safe couches and locked doors. It felt surreal, like witness protection without the paperwork. Ari lay awake, listening to unfamiliar house sounds, her mind racing not with grief now, but with calculation. Security cameras, routes, legal protections, emergency contacts. The victory had changed shape. It wasn't a finish line. It was a new battlefield. 2 days later, Ari received an email she hadn't expected. A job offer. A national civil rights organization in Washington, D.C. wanted her as senior counsel. Bigger platform, bigger resources, bigger protection. The kind of position that could make what happened in New Orleans matter on a larger scale. But it came with a question Ari couldn't answer quickly. Leave the city that made her, leave the people who needed her, leave the clinic she had built from nothing, or stay and endure the heat that followed truth. The backlash that always came when you forced power into daylight. Ari sat at her desk long after the office emptied, the offer letter open on her screen, her hands resting still on the keyboard. Outside, the sky bruised purple over the river. She thought of Graham again, not with longing, not with hatred, but with a distant clarity that felt almost sad. He had believed he could control outcomes because he had controlled her. He had believed the fall would destroy her too. Instead, it had simply revealed what he'd been standing on. And now Ari had to decide what came after the fall. Not for him, for herself. Because the truth had cost her safety, but lying had cost her soul. And she refused to pay that price again. 1 year later, Ariel Carter stood alone on the courthouse steps just before sunrise. The city was quiet in that rare, sacred way. No traffic, no voices, just the low hum of a place catching its breath. The stone beneath her feet was cool, solid, unchanged by everything that had happened inside its walls. She liked that. It reminded her that institutions could outlast men, and truth, if pressed hard enough, could outlast fear. Her left hand rested at her side, bare. No ring, no replacement, no symbol trying to convince the world she belonged to something other than herself. The absence felt deliberate now, not like loss, like space. In the months since the investigation concluded, Ari's life had not become easier. It had become clearer. The clinic had survived, leaner, stronger, protected by transparency and community instead of proximity to power. New cases came in from neighboring parishes. Young attorneys asked to train under her, not because she was untouchable, but because she had been tested and didn't disappear. Graham's name surfaced occasionally. A deferred prosecution, a quiet settlement, a reputation that never quite recovered its shine. When people brought him up, Ari listened without reaction. He no longer lived in her body. He no longer shaped her breath. That was the real ending. Not punishment, not forgiveness. Irrelevance. Ari had learned that closure didn't arrive with apologies. It arrived when you stopped needing them. She no longer rehearsed arguments in her head, no longer explained her choices to people committed to misunderstanding her. She spoke plainly now. She rested when she was tired. She trusted her instincts without asking permission. And love, when it returned to her life, as it eventually did, came without contracts that required her to be smaller. It came curious, respectful, unafraid of her fire. As the sun crested the skyline, Ari turned away from the steps and walked back into the city, not triumphant, not hardened, but certain. She had taken the worst betrayal of her life and refused to let it define her. She had chosen truth over comfort, clarity over chaos, herself over the performance of being chosen. And that choice had changed everything. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize pieces of yourself in Ari's silence, her fear, her resolve, take a moment to like, comment, and follow. Share it with someone who needs to hear this ending, because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can say is nothing at all. Just, I'm done.